Lieutenant Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold metal of the transport helicopter as it cut through the Afghan night sky. Below him, the mountains stretched like broken teeth against the moonless horizon. He could feel the familiar weight of his gear pressing against his shoulders. 60 pounds of ammunition, communications equipment, and survival tools that had become as much a part of him as his own skin over the past 8 years as a Navy SEAL. Sitting across from him, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. Her dark eyes were focused, calculating. She had earned her place among the elite not through politics or luck, but through pure skill and determination. Tonight, she would be their lifeline from above, piloting an A-10 Thunderbolt that waited at a forward operating base just 40 miles away. The mission briefing had been simple enough on paper. A high-value target had been located in a remote compound near the Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested the terrorist leader was planning a major attack on American soil within the next 72 hours. The window to stop him was closing fast. Jake's team consisted of 6 men, each handpicked for their specific skills. Tommy Chen handled explosives with the precision of a surgeon. Marcus Williams was their medic, a man who could patch up a gunshot wound while under heavy fire. David Parker served as their communications specialist, maintaining contact with command no matter how hostile the environment became. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 5 minutes to drop zone. Weather reports show a storm system moving in from the west. Could get nasty out there. Jake nodded, though he knew the pilot couldn't see him. Weather was always a factor in these operations, but they had trained for every possible scenario. What concerned him more was the intelligence report that had come in just hours before their departure. Local sources suggested increased enemy activity in the area, possibly indicating that their target knew they were coming. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Jake could see the terrain clearly for the first time. Rocky outcroppings dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. Deep valleys carved through the mountains, creating natural corridors that could either provide cover or become death traps depending on who controlled the high ground. The drop zone was a small clearing surrounded by steep hills on 3 sides. It was the only suitable landing area within reasonable distance of their target, but it also meant they would have limited options for extraction if things went wrong. Jake had learned long ago that in this business things often went wrong. Maria's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. Thunderbolt 1 is airborne and monitoring your frequency. I'll be your guardian angel tonight, boys. Weather's looking rough, but nothing this bird can't handle. The A-10 Warthog was built for close air support in hostile environments. Its titanium armor could withstand direct hits from small arms fire, and its massive GAU-8 cannon could tear through enemy positions like a hot knife through butter. More importantly, Maria had flown over 200 combat missions without losing a single soldier under her protection. As the helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and debris, Jake's team moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this dance hundreds of times before, but each mission carried its own unique dangers. Within 60 seconds, they were on the ground and moving toward their first checkpoint. The target compound sat in a valley approximately 3 miles from their landing zone. Intelligence photos showed a main building surrounded by several smaller structures, all protected by high walls and guard towers. Getting in would be challenging enough, but getting out alive would require perfect coordination between ground and air support. Jake activated his GPS unit and confirmed their position. The route to the compound would take them through rough terrain, but it would also provide natural concealment from enemy observation posts. They had roughly 4 hours of darkness remaining, which should be enough time to reach the target, complete their mission, and return to the extraction point. The first mile passed without incident. The team moved in single file, maintaining radio silence except for essential communications. Each man knew his role and understood that their lives depended on split-second timing and absolute trust in each other's abilities. As they approached the halfway point, David picked up enemy radio chatter on his monitoring equipment. The conversations were in Pashto, but the tone suggested increased alertness among the compound's defenders. Someone might have spotted their helicopter during the insertion, or perhaps routine patrols had discovered signs of their presence. Jake made the decision to alter their approach route, taking them through a narrow canyon that would add 20 minutes to their journey, but provide better concealment. It was a calculated risk. but one that might mean the difference between a successful mission and a firefight they weren't prepared to handle. The canyon walls rose nearly 100 feet on either side, creating an echo chamber that amplified every sound. The team moved even more carefully now, aware that a single loose rock could alert enemies to their position. Above them, storm clouds were beginning to gather, driven by winds that were growing stronger by the hour. Maria's voice provided reassurance through their earpieces. "Stormfront is moving faster than expected. I'm repositioning to maintain coverage of your area of operations. Visibility is still good from up here, but that might change quickly." As they emerged from the canyon and approached the final ridge overlooking their target, Jake could see lights in the compound below. The intelligence photos had been accurate. 3 main buildings surrounded by defensive walls with guard towers at each corner. What the photos hadn't shown were the additional vehicles parked outside the main gate and the increased number of armed men moving between the buildings. Their target was definitely inside that compound, but getting to him would be more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Jake studied the layout through his night vision scope, looking for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. The mission was still possible, but it would require every bit of skill and luck they could muster. The storm clouds overhead continued to thicken, and Jake could smell rain in the air. Within the next few hours, they would either be celebrating a successful mission or fighting for their lives in conditions that would test every aspect of their training. The only certainty was that there was no turning back now. Jake's team spent 20 minutes studying the compound from their position on the ridge. Through thermal imaging equipment, they could identify at least 15 enemy fighters moving between the buildings. The original intelligence had estimated 8 to 10 defenders, which meant their mission had become significantly more dangerous than planned. Tommy Chen crawled up beside Jake with his explosive charges carefully arranged in his pack. His job was to create breaches in the compound walls while the rest of the team provided cover and secured the target. He had been doing this work for 6 years and had never failed to open a door when his teammates needed it. "I count 3 good breach points," Tommy whispered, pointing to sections of the wall that appeared structurally weaker than the rest. "That corner position gives us the best angle of approach, but we'll be exposed for about 30 seconds while I set the charges." Marcus Williams adjusted his medical kit and checked his watch. As the team medic, he carried extra supplies because desert operations often meant long delays before proper medical evacuation could arrive. He had saved more lives than he could count, sometimes performing surgery with bullets flying overhead. The storm clouds were moving faster now, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the landscape in stark detail. The approaching weather would provide both advantages and challenges. Rain would muffle sounds and reduce visibility for defenders, but it would also make movement treacherous and could interfere with radio communications. David Parker monitored multiple radio frequencies, listening for any indication that their presence had been detected. Enemy communications remained routine, suggesting that the increased security was precautionary rather than a response to specific intelligence. This gave them a small advantage, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long once the shooting started. Maria's voice crackled through their headsets with an update from above. "Weather's deteriorating rapidly. I'm dealing with significant turbulence and decreasing visibility. Can maintain station for another 90 minutes, but after that, conditions might force me to return to base." Jake felt the first drops of rain on his face and knew they were running out of time. The original plan called for a deliberate approach, but circumstances were forcing them to accelerate their timeline. He made the decision to move immediately, while they still had air support, and before the storm made their mission impossible. The team moved down the ridge in a tactical formation that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. Each man knew his position and responsibilities. They moved like shadows across the rocky terrain, using natural cover to mask their approach to the compound walls. As they reached the perimeter, Jake could hear voices from inside the compound. Guards were talking casually, unaware that 6 heavily armed Navy SEALs were positioning themselves just outside their defensive walls. The rain was beginning to fall more steadily, creating a constant background noise that would help mask the sounds of their infiltration. Tommy reached the designated breach point and began setting his charges with mechanical precision. The plastic explosives were shaped to direct their force inward, creating a hole large enough for the team to pass through while minimizing the risk of structural collapse that could trap them inside. Jake positioned himself to provide overwatch while Tommy worked. Through his rifle scope, he could see movement in the nearest guard tower. 2 men were sheltering from the rain under a makeshift canopy. Their attention focused inward toward the compound rather than outward toward potential threats. Marcus and David took positions on either side of the planned breach point, ready to move through the moment the wall came down. The explosive charges would create a brief window of confusion among the defenders, and the team would have to exploit that advantage immediately. The radio crackled with Maria's voice from high above. "I'm tracking multiple heat signatures inside the compound. Looks like most of them are concentrated in the main building. You'll have a clear path to the target once you're inside the perimeter." Tommy gave the signal that his charges were set and armed. The team pulled back to a safe distance and prepared for the explosive breach. Jake counted down from 10, knowing that once those charges detonated, they would be committed to a course of action with no possibility of retreat. The explosion lit up the night like daylight for a brief moment. The carefully placed charges blew a hole in the wall exactly where Tommy had intended, sending chunks of concrete and dust flying in all directions. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder, masking the noise of the storm that was growing stronger overhead. Jake's team moved through the breach before the dust settled. Years of training took over as they flowed into the compound like water, finding the path of least resistance. Each man knew his sector of responsibility and moved to secure his assigned area with practiced efficiency. The explosion had caught the defenders completely by surprise. Shouts of confusion came from multiple directions as enemy fighters tried to understand what was happening and organize a response. This confusion was exactly what Jake had been counting on, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Marcus reached the main building first and took cover behind a concrete barrier. Through the windows, he could see armed men moving inside, their silhouettes backlit by interior lights. The building appeared to have 2 floors, with most of the activity concentrated on the ground level. David established a communication post near the breach point and began monitoring enemy radio traffic. The defenders were starting to coordinate their response, but their communications were confused and contradictory. Some reported an attack from the east, while others insisted the threat was coming from the north. Tommy moved toward a secondary building that intelligence reports suggested might contain weapons storage or communications equipment. His job was to prevent the defenders from calling for reinforcements, while the rest of the team focused on capturing their primary target. The rain was falling harder now, turning the compound's dirt courtyard into a muddy mess that made movement treacherous. Lightning flashes provided intermittent illumination that revealed the positions of both friendly and enemy forces in stark detail. Jake advanced toward the main building where their target was believed to be located. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorist leader preferred to stay on the ground floor, in a room that had been reinforced against attack. Getting to him would mean fighting through multiple layers of defenders who knew the building's layout better than the American team. Through his earpiece, Jake could hear Maria's voice struggling against increasing static from the storm. "Visibility dropping rapidly up here. I can still see thermal signatures, but targeting anything specific is becoming difficult. You need to mark your positions clearly if you want close air support." The first enemy gunfire erupted from the main building as Jake approached. Muzzle flashes lit up the windows like deadly fireflies, and bullets began impacting the ground around his position. The defenders had recovered from their initial shock and were beginning to mount an organized resistance. Jake dove behind a concrete planter and returned fire toward the building. His rifle scope allowed him to identify specific targets even in the poor lighting conditions. He could see armed men moving between windows, trying to get clear shots at the American team while avoiding exposure to return fire. The mission was proceeding according to plan, but Jake knew that the most dangerous part was yet to come. Getting into the compound had been challenging, but getting their target and escaping alive would require perfect coordination between all team members and their air support overhead. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the compound's defenders realized they were under attack by a highly trained special operations team. Jake could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper sound of machine gun fire coming from the guard towers. The element of surprise was gone, and now it would be a straight fight between professionals. Marcus pressed himself against the wall of the main building and tossed a flashbang grenade through a ground floor window. The explosion created a brilliant flash of light and deafening noise that temporarily disabled the defenders inside. He followed immediately with a second grenade, giving the team a few precious seconds to advance their positions. Tommy had reached the communications building and was working to disable the enemy's ability to call for reinforcements. Through the windows, he could see sophisticated radio equipment and what appeared to be a satellite uplink system. Destroying this equipment would prevent the terrorists from alerting other cells about the American raid. David's monitoring equipment picked up frantic radio chatter as the compound's defenders tried to coordinate their response. Some were calling for help from nearby camps, while others were reporting conflicting information about the size and location of the attacking force. The confusion was working in the Americans' favor, but it wouldn't last much longer. The storm overhead was intensifying rapidly. Lightning strikes illuminated the compound in stark flashes, creating a strobe effect that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Rain was falling in sheets now, turning visibility to almost zero and making the already treacherous footing even more dangerous. Maria's voice came through their headsets with increasing static interference. "Storm's really hitting hard up here. Instruments are going crazy and I'm fighting severe turbulence. I can barely maintain position, but I'm not leaving you guys down there." Jake advanced toward the main building entrance, using vehicles and concrete barriers for cover, as enemy fire continued to pour from the windows above. His target was somewhere inside that building, and every minute they spent fighting outside increased the risk that their mission would fail. A defender appeared in a second-story window with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Jake recognized the threat immediately and dove for cover, as the explosive round impacted where he had been standing just seconds before. The blast showered him with concrete fragments and left his ears ringing, but his body armor had protected him from serious injury. Marcus saw the RPG team reloading and took careful aim with his rifle. His shot took out the primary gunner, but a second man immediately moved to take his place. The defenders were well trained and determined to protect whatever secrets their compound contained. Tommy succeeded in destroying the communications equipment with carefully placed explosive charges. The blast took out not only the radio gear but also the building's electrical system, plunging half the compound into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on in some areas, but overall visibility was significantly reduced. The loss of their communications capability caused immediate panic among the defenders. Without coordination between their various positions, they began firing wildly in all directions, sometimes endangering their own people. This breakdown in discipline gave the American team new opportunities to advance. Jake reached the main building entrance and found it heavily barricaded. Steel plates had been welded over the original door, and additional concrete barriers had been constructed to create a defensive position. Getting through would require more explosive charges, but Tommy was still dealing with defenders in the communications building. David had established a new position near the center of the compound and was providing covering fire for his teammates. His rifle was equipped with a thermal scope that could penetrate the rain and darkness to identify enemy heat signatures. He methodically eliminated defenders who tried to move between buildings. The sound of automatic weapons fire was constant now, creating an echo chamber effect within the compound walls. Spent ammunition casings littered the ground, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the ozone scent of the approaching storm. Combat was always chaotic, but the weather was adding an extra layer of confusion. Maria's A-10 thundered overhead, but the storm was making it nearly impossible for her to provide effective close air support. The combination of rain, lightning, and severe turbulence meant she couldn't risk firing her weapons without potentially hitting friendly forces. She maintained her position anyway, ready to help if the situation became desperate. Jake decided to try a different approach to entering the main building. Instead of fighting through the heavily defended front entrance, he would climb to the roof and enter from above. The building appeared to have a skylight or rooftop access that might provide a way inside. Using a rappelling rope and climbing gear from his pack, Jake began scaling the outside wall of the building. The rain made the concrete slippery and dangerous, but his training had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. Hand over hand, he pulled himself toward the roof while gunfire continued below. Marcus and David maintained suppressive fire to keep the defenders focused on ground-level threats while their team leader attempted his climbing assault. Their ammunition supplies were limited, so every shot had to count. They had trained for extended firefights, but the intensity of resistance was higher than anticipated. Tommy completed his work in the communications building and began moving toward the main structure to support his teammates. Along the way, he encountered two defenders who had taken cover behind a water tank. The brief firefight ended quickly, but it cost him valuable time and ammunition. As Jake reached the roof of the main building, lightning struck a metal antenna just 50 feet away. The electrical discharge was so close that he could feel the energy in the air, and the thunder that followed was deafening. The storm was becoming as dangerous as the enemy forces they were fighting. From his elevated position, Jake could see the entire compound layout clearly for the first time. There were more defensive positions than intelligence reports had indicated, and several buildings that hadn't appeared on aerial photographs. The enemy had been preparing for exactly this type of raid. Through a skylight, Jake could see into the main building's upper floor. Armed men were positioned at windows, firing down at his teammates in the courtyard below. Their target was likely on the ground floor, probably in a reinforced room that could serve as both office and bunker. Jake attached a small explosive charge to the skylight frame and prepared to make his entry into the building. Once he went through that opening, he would be committed to a close-quarters battle in an environment controlled by his enemies. There would be no backup plan and no easy way out. The charge detonated with a sharp crack, shattering the skylight glass and creating an opening large enough for Jake to drop through. He descended on his rope into a hallway that was lit only by emergency lighting. The sound of gunfire from outside was muffled but still audible through the building's walls. Jake's mission was just beginning. He still had to find his target, capture him alive if possible, and then fight his way back out through a compound full of determined defenders. The storm overhead was growing worse by the minute, and his air support was being pushed to its limits. Jake landed softly in the second-floor hallway of the main building, his boots making almost no sound on the concrete floor despite the chaos erupting outside. The interior was dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows down the corridor. He could hear voices speaking in Pashto coming from rooms on both sides of the hallway, and the sound of footsteps moving quickly across wooden floors. The building's layout was different from what intelligence photos had suggested. Additional walls had been constructed to create smaller rooms, possibly for security reasons or to accommodate more people than originally planned. Jake would have to clear each room systematically while looking for stairs that would take him to the ground floor, where his target was most likely located. Through his earpiece, he could hear Marcus and David continuing their firefight in the compound courtyard. Their ammunition was running low, and they were calling for Tommy to bring additional supplies from their emergency cache near the breach point. The situation outside was deteriorating, which meant Jake had limited time to complete his part of the mission. The first room Jake encountered appeared to be a sleeping quarters with multiple beds arranged dormitory style. Personal belongings were scattered around, suggesting that people had left quickly when the attack began. He found documents written in Arabic and Pashto, but nothing that immediately identified the location of his primary target. A defender suddenly appeared at the far end of the hallway, raising his rifle toward Jake's position. Both men fired simultaneously, their muzzle flashes lighting up the corridor like strobe lights. Jake's shot was more accurate, and the defender dropped to the floor, but the sound of gunfire inside the building would alert others to his presence. Jake moved quickly toward the stairway he had spotted at the center of the building. As he descended to the ground floor, he could hear multiple voices shouting commands and the sound of furniture being moved to create defensive positions. The building's occupants were preparing for a siege. The ground floor consisted of several larger rooms that appeared to serve different purposes. One contained sophisticated computer equipment and communication gear that had not been destroyed by Tommy's attack on the external communications building. Another room was filled with weapons and ammunition, suggesting this compound served as more than just a safe house. Jake could hear his target's voice coming from what appeared to be a reinforced office at the rear of the building. Intelligence reports had described the terrorist leader's distinctive speaking style, and Jake was confident he had located the right person. The challenge now would be getting through the defensive positions between his current location and that office. Two defenders had positioned themselves behind an overturned table in the main corridor, creating a choke point that would be difficult to bypass. Jake used a small mirror from his equipment kit to observe their positions without exposing himself to their fire. They appeared to be well armed and prepared for a long fight. Outside, the storm had reached full intensity. Lightning strikes were occurring every few seconds, and the thunder was so loud it could be heard clearly even inside the building. Rain was driving horizontally against the windows with such force that some of the glass was beginning to crack under the pressure. Maria's voice came through Jake's earpiece with heavy static interference. "I'm having serious problems up here. Lightning struck my aircraft twice in the last 5 minutes, and I'm losing electrical systems. I can stay on station for maybe another 15 minutes, but after that, I'll have to return to base or risk losing the aircraft entirely." Jake knew that losing air support would make extraction extremely difficult, but he also understood that Maria couldn't risk her life and aircraft indefinitely. He had to complete his mission quickly and get his team to the extraction point before the weather made helicopter pickup impossible. The two defenders in the corridor were maintaining disciplined fire control, taking careful shots whenever they detected movement. Jake decided to use a fragmentary grenade to flush them from their position. The explosion in the confined space would be devastating, but it was the quickest way to eliminate the threat. After pulling the pin, Jake counted to 3 before throwing the grenade down the corridor. He pressed himself against the wall and covered his ears as the explosion rocked the building. Dust and debris filled the air, and the emergency lighting flickered from the shockwave. When the smoke cleared, Jake could see that his grenade had been effective. The overturned table was destroyed, and the two defenders were no longer a threat. However, the explosion had also alerted everyone else in the building to his exact location. He would have to move quickly before they could organize a coordinated response. The reinforced office door was made of steel and appeared to have additional armor plating welded to its surface. Getting through would require either explosive charges or finding another way into the room. Jake could hear voices inside, including what sounded like his target giving orders to subordinates. A window in the office faced the compound courtyard, but it was covered with steel bars that would prevent entry from outside. Jake could see movement through the gaps between the bars, confirming that multiple people were inside the room. Capturing his target alive while dealing with armed bodyguards would require precise timing and overwhelming force. Jake attached a shaped charge to the office door and took cover around the corner. The explosive was designed to blow the door inward while minimizing damage to the room's occupants. His orders were to capture the terrorist leader alive if possible, as the intelligence he possessed could prevent future attacks. The explosion blew the door completely off its hinges and filled the office with smoke and dust. Jake moved through the opening immediately, his rifle ready and night vision equipment allowing him to see clearly despite the poor lighting conditions. 3 men were in the room, including his primary target. The terrorist leader was exactly as described in intelligence briefings, a tall man with a distinctive beard and scarring on his left hand from an old bomb-making accident. He appeared to be reaching for a weapon, but Jake's voice stopped him before he could complete the movement. "Don't move. American forces, you are under arrest." The 2 bodyguards made the mistake of reaching for their weapons despite Jake's clear warning. He had no choice but to fire, and both men dropped to the floor within seconds. The terrorist leader raised his hand slowly, recognizing that resistance would be futile. Jake zip-tied his prisoner's hands behind his back and conducted a quick search for weapons or suicide devices. Many high-value targets carried explosives that would allow them to kill themselves and their captors, rather than face interrogation. This man appeared to be unarmed, but Jake remained cautious. Through his earpiece, Marcus's voice carried urgency and concern. "Jake, we're running low on ammunition out here, and the enemy is bringing up reinforcements from somewhere. We need to move to the extraction point soon, or we're going to be overrun." Jake acknowledged the transmission and began moving his prisoner toward the stairway. Getting out of the building would be as dangerous as getting in had been, especially with a captive who might try to escape or alert his remaining followers to the Americans' location. The mission was entering its most critical phase. Jake had successfully captured his target, but now he had to get him safely out of the compound and to the extraction point while his team dealt with increasing enemy pressure and deteriorating weather conditions that threatened their air support. Jake pushed his prisoner up the stairs toward the 2nd floor, but the sound of multiple vehicles approaching the compound made him pause. Through the broken windows, he could see headlights cutting through the rain as reinforcements arrived from nearby terrorist camps. What had been a challenging mission was now becoming a desperate fight for survival. Marcus's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled panic. "We've got big problems out here. At least 3 vehicles with heavy weapons just pulled up outside the compound. I'm counting 15 to 20 additional fighters, and they're setting up a machine gun position at the main gate." Tommy had taken cover behind a concrete wall near the communications building, but enemy fire was keeping him pinned down. He could see muzzle flashes coming from multiple directions as the new arrivals spread out to surround the compound. His explosive charges had destroyed the main communications equipment, but someone must have gotten a message out before the raid began. David was monitoring enemy radio traffic and reporting increasingly organized coordination among the defenders. The confusion that had initially worked in the Americans' favor was being replaced by disciplined tactics as a more experienced commander took control of the defensive effort. The storm overhead was reaching hurricane-like intensity. Lightning strikes were hitting the compound area every few seconds, and the thunder was so constant it sounded like artillery fire. Rain was falling so hard that visibility was reduced to just a few yards, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from enemy. Maria's A-10 was struggling to maintain position above the battle. Lightning had damaged several of her aircraft's electronic systems, and the turbulence was so severe she could barely control the plane. Her radio transmissions were breaking up badly, but Jake could still hear her trying to provide updates on enemy positions. Multiple signatures surrounding, compound, visibility, 0, can't, targeting. Jake realized that air support was effectively gone. The storm had grounded Maria's A-10 as surely as if enemy missiles had shot it down. His team was now completely on their own against overwhelming odds with no possibility of reinforcement or close air support. The terrorist leader Jake had captured seemed to understand the situation and was becoming more confident. He began speaking rapidly in Pashto, possibly trying to communicate with his followers through the building's walls. Jake silenced him with a firm warning, but he knew the man was calculating his chances of escape. As Jake reached the second-floor window he had entered through, he could see that the compound courtyard was now controlled by enemy forces. His teammates were trapped in defensive positions with limited ammunition and no clear route to the extraction point. The mission had gone from difficult to impossible in a matter of minutes. Marcus had found cover behind an armored vehicle, but enemy fire was chipping away at his protection with each passing minute. His medical supplies were running low, and he had already treated minor wounds on both himself and David. Without resupply or extraction soon, they would be overwhelmed. Tommy attempted to fight his way toward his teammates' positions, but the arrival of enemy reinforcements had cut off most routes through the compound. He was effectively isolated in the northern section, while the rest of his team was pinned down in the south. Breaking out would require coordinated movement at exactly the right moment. David's communication equipment was picking up radio traffic that suggested even more enemy forces were en route to the compound. Local tribal leaders were calling in fighters from across the region, turning what should have been a quick raid into a major battle that the Americans couldn't possibly win. The rain was making movement treacherous for both sides. The compound's dirt surfaces had turned into slippery mud, and visibility was so poor that soldiers were sometimes firing at shadows rather than actual targets. The storm was becoming as much of an enemy as the terrorist forces. Jake made the decision to attempt an escape through the building's rear exit, hoping to avoid the main concentration of enemy forces in the courtyard. With his prisoner in tow, he began moving down the second-floor corridor toward a window that overlooked the back of the compound. Through the rain-streaked glass, Jake could see that the rear area was not as heavily defended as the front, but there were still armed guards moving between buildings. Getting his prisoner to the extraction point would require crossing nearly a mile of open ground, while being hunted by dozens of enemy fighters. The terrorist leader suddenly tried to break free, throwing himself against Jake in an attempt to escape. The struggle lasted only seconds before Jake regained control, but the noise attracted the attention of defenders who had entered the building through the destroyed front entrance. Footsteps on the stairs indicated that multiple enemy fighters were ascending to the second floor. Jake had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached his position. He could either stand and fight, which would likely result in his death and the loss of his prisoner, or attempt a desperate escape through the rear window. Marcus's voice came through the radio one more time. "Jake, wherever you are, we're about to be overrun. Our ammunition is nearly gone and they're massing for a final assault. If you're going to get out with the package, you need to move now. Jake attached his rappelling rope to a structural beam and prepared to lower himself and his prisoner out the rear window. The two-story drop would be dangerous, especially with a reluctant captive. But staying in the building meant certain death or capture. Enemy voices were now clearly audible in the hallway just outside the room where Jake was positioned. He could hear them coordinating their search and calling out instructions to each other. They knew exactly where he was and were preparing to storm the room in overwhelming numbers. The first enemy fighter appeared in the doorway just as Jake began his descent out the window. A brief exchange of gunfire echoed through the building, but Jake was already halfway down the exterior wall with his prisoner. Bullets impacted the wall around them, sending chips of concrete flying in all directions. Jake hit the ground hard and immediately began moving toward the compound's rear wall. Behind him, he could see muzzle flashes in the window he had just exited as enemy fighters tried to get clear shots through the rain and darkness. The storm was providing concealment, but it was also making every step a struggle. The extraction point was still over a mile away through terrain that was now controlled by hostile forces. Jake's teammates were trapped in the compound with dwindling ammunition and no hope of relief. The mission that had started as a surgical strike to capture one man had become a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Maria's A-10 was somewhere above the storm clouds, but lightning and turbulence had made it impossible for her to provide any meaningful support. Jake and his team were truly on their own, facing a situation that would test every aspect of their training and determination. The terrorist leader, Jake, was dragging through the mud, understood the Americans' desperate situation, and was becoming increasingly resistant. He knew that rescue was nearby and that his captor's position was hopeless. Jake would have to maintain control of his prisoner while fighting running battles against superior numbers all the way to the extraction point. Jake dragged his prisoner through the compound's rear gate while gunfire erupted behind them. The terrorist leader was fighting every step, knowing that his followers were close and that the American team was in desperate trouble. Jake had to maintain control while moving as quickly as possible through terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to travel through it during a storm. The rain was falling so hard it felt like being hit with a fire hose. Every step was a struggle against mud that grabbed at their boots and rocks made slippery by the constant downpour. Lightning strikes were illuminating the landscape in brief, terrifying flashes that revealed just how exposed they were to enemy observation. Behind them in the compound, Marcus and David were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Tommy had managed to fight his way back toward their position, but he was wounded and moving slowly. The three men had taken cover in a small building near the breach point, but enemy forces were closing in from all directions. Through the static-filled radio, Jake could hear his teammates coordinating their final stand. They were discussing destroying sensitive equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands and making plans for a fighting withdrawal that they all knew would probably end in their deaths. "Jake, if you can hear this, get the package to the extraction point," Marcus transmitted. "Don't worry about us. Complete the mission." "That's an order." Jake wanted to turn back and help his teammates, but he knew that their sacrifice would be meaningless if he didn't get the terrorist leader safely to the helicopter landing zone. The intelligence this man possessed could prevent attacks that would kill thousands of innocent people. The extraction point was located in a valley approximately 1 mile from the compound. Under normal circumstances, the journey would take 20 to 30 minutes for a fit soldier. With a reluctant prisoner and hostile forces searching for them, it could take much longer, assuming they survived at all. Jake's prisoner suddenly threw himself sideways, trying to break the zip-tie restraints around his wrists. The move was unexpected and nearly successful, but Jake managed to regain control after a brief struggle that left both men covered in mud and breathing hard from the exertion. "Try that again and I'll drag you unconscious," Jake warned in Arabic, one of the few phrases he had memorized for situations like this. The terrorist leader glared at him with undisguised hatred, but stopped resisting for the moment. He was calculating his chances and waiting for a better opportunity to escape. Jake would have to remain constantly vigilant while navigating treacherous terrain in near-zero visibility. Through the rain, Jake could hear vehicle engines starting up in the compound. Enemy forces were beginning mobile patrols to search for the American who had escaped with their leader. These vehicles would be able to cover ground much faster than a man on foot. Even in the difficult conditions, a lightning strike hit a tree less than 50 yards away, splitting the trunk and sending burning branches flying through the air. The electrical discharge was so close that Jake could smell the ozone and feel the static electricity making his hair stand up underneath his helmet. The terrorist leader saw the lightning strike as an opportunity and tried to run toward the burning tree, perhaps hoping to signal his location to the search parties. Jake tackled him before he could travel more than a few steps, and both men went down hard in the mud and rocks. As they struggled, Jake could hear the sound of vehicles getting closer. Headlight beams were cutting through the rain, sweeping back and forth as the drivers tried to spot any movement in the darkness. The search was becoming more organized and systematic with each passing minute. Jake pulled his prisoner into a small ravine that offered concealment from the searching vehicles. The depression was filling with water from the storm, but it was better than being exposed on open ground. They would have to wait for the immediate search to pass before continuing. Toward the extraction point, the sound of automatic weapons fire from the compound indicated that his teammates were still alive and fighting. Jake could distinguish the slower rate of fire that meant they were conserving ammunition and choosing their targets carefully. They were professionals who would make the enemy pay dearly for every inch of ground. Maria's voice suddenly broke through the radio static with startling clarity. "Jake, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to attempt one more pass over your area. Lightning has knocked out most of my electronics, but the engines are still running. If you can mark your position somehow, I might be able to help." Jake knew that flying an A-10 in these weather conditions was probably suicidal, but Maria was willing to risk her life to save her fellow soldiers. He had emergency flares in his pack that could mark his location, but using them would also alert every enemy fighter in the area to his exact position. The sound of vehicles was moving away from their hiding position, but Jake could still see headlight beams sweeping across the landscape. The search pattern suggested that the enemy had a good idea of which direction he had traveled, but hadn't pinpointed his exact location yet. Jake's prisoner was shivering from the cold and wet, but his eyes remained alert and calculating. He was listening to the sounds of the search and probably trying to determine how close rescue might be. Jake would have to make a difficult decision about whether to continue hiding or risk movement toward the extraction point. The radio crackled with Tommy's voice, barely audible through the interference. "Multiple vehicles, compound. Running low, can't hold much longer." Jake realized that his teammates were about to be overrun, and there was nothing he could do to help them. His mission was to get the terrorist leader to the extraction point alive, even if it meant sacrificing the men who had served with him for years. A new sound cut through the storm, the distinctive whine of an A-10's engines under stress. Maria was making her promised pass despite weather conditions that should have grounded any aircraft. Jake could see navigation lights blinking through the clouds, barely visible through the rain. Jake made his decision. He pulled out an emergency flare and prepared to ignite it, knowing that the signal would bring both help and enemy attention. His teammates were dying in the compound behind him, and his air support was risking everything to give him one chance at extraction. The flare burst to life with brilliant red light that cut through the darkness like a beacon. For 30 seconds, Jake's position would be clearly visible to anyone within miles. It was either salvation or suicide, and he would know which within the next few minutes. Maria's A-10 banked sharply toward the flare's location, but enemy vehicles were also converging on the light. The race was on to see who would reach Jake's position first, his rescue or his death. The storm continued to rage around them all, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath its fury. Maria Rodriguez pushed her damaged A-10 Thunderbolt through turbulence that would have destroyed a lesser aircraft. Lightning had knocked out her primary navigation systems. Her radio was cutting in and out, and she was flying almost blind through the worst storm she had ever encountered. But below her, American soldiers were dying, and she was their only hope for survival. The red flare cut through the darkness like a desperate prayer, marking Jake's position but also alerting every enemy fighter in the area. Maria could see vehicle headlights converging on the signal from multiple directions. She had maybe 3 minutes before the rescue attempt became a recovery mission. Jake pressed himself and his prisoner against the side of the ravine as the first enemy vehicle crested the ridge above them. The truck's headlights swept across their hiding position, and Jake could hear voices shouting orders in Pashto. Discovery seemed inevitable, but the flare was still burning, making it difficult for the searchers to see anything else in the immediate area. The A-10's engine screamed overhead as Maria began her attack run. Even through the storm, Jake could hear the distinctive sound of the Gu-8 cannon spinning up to firing speed. 7 barrels capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute were about to bring salvation from above. The cannon opened fire with a sound like the world ending. The enemy vehicle that had been closest to discovering Jake's position simply disappeared in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The depleted uranium rounds didn't just destroy the truck, they erased it from existence and left a crater where it had been. Maria banked sharply and lined up on a second target, but lightning struck her aircraft's tail section at the same moment. Electrical systems failed throughout the plane, and she lost control for several terrifying seconds before managing to level out just 100 feet above the ground. "This is Thunderbolt 1. Maria transmitted through heavy static. "I'm hit but still flying. Making another pass to clear the area around your position. Get ready to move when I give the signal." Jake could see that the attack had scattered the enemy search teams, but they would regroup quickly once they realized the aircraft was damaged. Maria's A-10 was trailing smoke and flying erratically, clearly struggling to maintain altitude and control. The terrorist leader Jake was guarding had watched the destruction with a mixture of fear and calculation. The American air support was devastating, but the aircraft was obviously damaged. If he could delay his captor for just a few more minutes, his followers might still rescue him. Jake pulled his prisoner out of the ravine and began moving toward the extraction point while Maria made her second attack run. The enemy vehicles that had survived her first pass were now taking evasive action, but the A-10's cannon was still functional despite the lightning damage. Another burst of cannon fire lit up the night as Maria destroyed a machine gun position that had been set up to cover the road to the extraction point. But this time, the muzzle flash revealed the full extent of damage to her aircraft. The tail section was badly burned, and part of her left wing was missing. In the compound behind them, Marcus, Tommy, and David heard the sound of the A-10's cannon and realized their teammate might actually escape with the prisoner. They were down to their last few rounds of ammunition, but the knowledge that their sacrifice might not be in vain gave them renewed determination. Jake reached the extraction point just as the evacuation helicopter appeared through the storm clouds. The pilot was fighting the same turbulence and electrical interference that had nearly brought down Maria's A-10, but he managed to reach the landing zone and begin his approach despite the dangerous conditions. Enemy forces had regrouped and were converging on the extraction point from 3 directions. Jake could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as hostile fighters tried to prevent the helicopter from landing. The pilot would have only seconds to get on the ground and take off again before being overwhelmed. Maria saw the situation developing below and made a decision that would either save her fellow soldiers or kill them all. Instead of trying to land her damaged aircraft safely at a distant airbase, she would use it as a weapon to clear the landing zone. "Jake, get that helicopter loaded and airborne," Maria transmitted. "I'm coming in hot to clear the area. This is my last pass." The A-10 Thunderbolt dove toward the ground at an angle that no aircraft should attempt, especially one that was already damaged and flying through a severe storm. Maria was essentially turning her plane into a guided missile, using her remaining fuel and ammunition to create a zone of destruction around the landing zone. Her cannon fired continuously as she descended, the depleted uranium rounds tearing through enemy positions like a buzzsaw through cardboard. Vehicle after vehicle exploded in showers of sparks and flame as the damaged A-10 became an angel of death dropping from the storm clouds. Jake threw his prisoner into the helicopter and climbed in after him just as Maria's aircraft passed overhead at an altitude that couldn't have been more than 50 feet. The blast from her engines and the shockwave from her cannon fire scattered the remaining enemy forces and created a temporary bubble of safety around the landing zone. The helicopter pilot didn't wait for clearance or confirmation. He pulled pitch and lifted off immediately, climbing as rapidly as possible through the turbulent air while Jake secured his prisoner and tried to establish radio contact with his teammates back at the compound. Marcus's voice came through the headset with the calm professionalism that had defined his military career. "Package is secure and airborne. Mission accomplished. We'll hold this position as long as possible, but don't wait for us. Get that intelligence back to headquarters. Jake wanted to order the helicopter to return for his teammates, but he knew that the landing zone was already being reoccupied by enemy forces. Going back would mean losing the prisoner and probably the helicopter crew as well. Sometimes leadership meant making impossible decisions. Maria's A-10 was no longer visible through the storm, but Jake could hear her engines somewhere in the darkness. She had expended all her ammunition and most of her fuel in the attack on the landing zone, and her aircraft was too damaged to make it back to base. Like his teammates in the compound, she had sacrificed everything to complete the mission. The helicopter climbed through the storm clouds toward safety, carrying the terrorist leader whose capture would prevent countless innocent deaths. Below them, the compound continued to burn, and the storm raged on with indifferent fury. The mission had been completed, but the cost had been higher than anyone could have imagined. 3 days later, intelligence extracted from the captured terrorist leader would prevent a coordinated attack on American soil that could have killed thousands. The sacrifice of Marcus, Tommy, and David had not been in vain. Maria Rodriguez had ejected from her dying aircraft and was rescued after 3 days of survival in the Afghan mountains. Jake Morrison would carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life. Knowing that sometimes the hardest victories are the ones that feel like defeats, the mission was successful, but the price of success is sometimes measured in the lives of heroes who never came home.